Bob Beetham is a local longtime basketball observer and public address announcer. He's so passionate about the game in Maine that he's drafted a 4-class alignment proposal based on the last 8 years of both the recent 5-class system and the 4-class one before that. Beetham wants to see more competitive victory margins, plus the achievement of making a tournament to mean more.
Certainly there's been a significant increase in the amount of non-competitive games. I think going back to 4 classes will certainly alleviate a lot of that. It should be a significant accomplishment for anybody to get to a tournament. So when you have 8 out of 10 teams going in the Class A tournament, how much of an achievement is that really? I think that we need to get back to really competitiveness in athletics, and I think one way we can do that is to go back to 4 classes.
Any potential reclassification from the Maine Principals Association would come in 2025 to 26. We have a copy of Beetham's very thorough proposal on our website.